Good afternoon. How are you today? Well, let's see. Thomas Jefferson has delivered us for his weather report, a temperature of 89 degrees. It's as still as could be. The sun is out, and it's pleasant in the shade. When I was a kid, I used to get tan if I was very careful. Otherwise, I'd just turn red as a beet. And I had one person that said that what happened was my freckles just proliferated, and that was my tan. So, but Irish skin, mostly German, English. I have to be careful about the sun. We all do. So, what do you want to talk about today? There are a number of stories we could talk about, but because of my alma mater, Colombia, I occasionally think about what's going on there, how did it happen, and how can it be resolved. And there's always a chicken and egg problem with these things. But let me take you back to Colombia in 1968. Before the students demonstrated at Columbia in that year, we had the Tet Offensive, which appeared to show that American forces were not succeeding. We had the resignation of LBJ as president in the sense of that he wasn't going to seek another term, which set off Bobby Kennedy and Gene McCarthy to run for it against Humphrey, who was LBJ's chosen successor. And then we had the assassination of Martin Luther King. It's in that context that there were demonstrations at Columbia. And SDS, that were the leaders of the effort, Students for a Democratic Society, apparently they met among themselves and wanted to narrow the issues down to something that they could talk about. So the question was, IDA was Colombia cooperating in the war effort? And the other was whether or not a gymnasium that was being created in a park that some would argue belonged to Harlem and not to the university showed racism of some sort. But the feeling was enormous that the center was not holding, to invoke the poetry of it, and that those who would be our stand-in parents didn't have it under control. Now, the students were really divided when this started, and it started in part because Mark Rudd, who headed up SDS with the steering committee, he had been disciplined for a demonstration about the war. And so there was already blood in the water, if you will, in a metaphorical political sense. And it went from there, and amnesty for that action became one of their objectives. But it took on a life of its own. It was born of frustration. And people more moderate than SDS got involved. And there were inspirational moments in this mixture of protest, youthful angst, and civil disobedience. But of course, civil disobedience, you say, I'm prepared to take the punch in the mouth if that's what comes from protesting against something that I think is so wrong. And when the students took over Low Library, that is, they got into the office of the president of the university, they found support for what they were saying that had been dismissed to a great extent because of the hyperbole of SDS. So how is that like what we're going through today? We have a country in which certainly some are really way above the law. And it appears that anybody that comes within close proximity of Trump is among those who are sheltered and protected by our so-called system of equal justice. We have layers of problems in our society, and they're not being dealt with, and we're not applying the rules. And the results we're getting are mixed. We have adults across America, including you and I probably, who step back from daily coverage rather than have this insinuate into our lives that believe such misconduct by a government, such failed policies, should not be the rule of the day. We literally have a person running for the presidency who's charged with multiple crimes and been found responsible for mammoth cons and false statements to avoid paying money he should and to get money he probably shouldn't have, who defames and abuses women in various ways. And he's a threat to become the President of the United States. If that doesn't sound like a society out of order, something like what happened at Colombia when I was a young man. I decided to read some of the old material that I have. One was a great Vanity Fair article. And one of the accounts by one of the participants was how he was at the mathematics building. That is what it was called. And he saw officers there, and so he ran from inside the campus out to Broadway, the public street. And he had an officer chasing him on horseback. And he thought he can't outrun a horse. And the officer on his mount had a stick. So what he did was he crawled underneath the car on Broadway to avoid getting beaten. All sorts of people were beaten in the head. The tactical police force that came to Colombia, they were all like 6'3", and they were powerful and they were fighters, and they came to do business. Now we had arrests and we had resistance, but I guess we learned that much from the first demonstration. So, what is the responsibility of a university when you have twin states attacking each other in such a deathly way, in violation of the rules of war, literally constituting war crimes? Can we put the genie back in the bottle in any other way than to do what students today feel like they did years ago, that our government is not working for us? And there's no question that's true. When you can beat a black to death on a misdemeanor that's unproven, and you can't pass laws to protect persons of color from that happening, you're failing as a government. When a 50-year-old right that a woman enjoys is no longer available, and the law among the several states, which is an argument in and of itself that there should only be one law nationwide, and it should be a right that is guaranteed, one against every other person who might disagree with it. When you take that away, is the government working? When we hear on the air, people can do things that are unethical, but they're not crimes, but I think they are crimes. When day by day we listen about the sorry state of a former president whose flatulence fills the room and whose horrible, indecent expressions are stated on a daily basis by him without respect for law or order or history or anything. So what's going to happen in Colombia? The seeds of Colombia, both when I was a young man and now, were planted before the demonstrations. And you can't isolate the demonstrations from what has caused them. And what's caused them is a failure to, and they're older than this, the children of America who are demonstrating. Now at Colombia, I don't know how to characterize it, but I would say that those who are concerned because as Muslims, it appears America is not protecting those who are being killed one by one in Gaza. And that is innocents, women, children. On the other hand, we have what Hamas did in Israel and what Iran has done. So I say, the center's not holding again. Now Colombia took, after the demonstrations in the 60s, took time to recover. And one might say it was chosen in part for this style objection, because I think 20% of the student body is Jewish. In other words, like everything else, there's an impurity in protest that has a larger political agenda. But if there's a legitimate part of protest, it's almost always for peace over war. I think that the action, both in the 60s and now, is flawed when it's speech plus action. Now we see it more these days in the demonstrations at Colombia particularly, where there doesn't appear to be counter demonstrations by those of Jewish faith or Jewish culture who are the target of the offenses by slander and conduct. I don't think the university perhaps can do more in its narrow range of powers than just let the clock run out like a cheap trick in a basketball game. No one will be satisfied. But the main arena that has failed us is our government. How long did Congress, particularly on the Republican side, delay and deter help for those in the Middle East and those in Ukraine? How does it help us for the Speaker of the Republican caucus to go to Colombia and say, you know what we need here? We need troops here like those that were out of control at Kent State. No one starts believing that's going to happen, but you create a tinderbox and you throw a match, and then that's what you have. So, do I have a solution for this? I think the break point has been a series of failures to govern our foreign policy faithful to our national policies and beliefs. I give credit to the Secretary of State going back and forth. I give credit to the President for pushing a two-state solution. I give credit to those who think we should have a ceasefire. But I'm not a student at the campus. I'm not 25 anymore, or whatever age they are. I've seen a lot, experienced a lot. And this is what happens when law and policy and tradition mean nothing. And who's responsible for that? Well, of course, Trump. But Trump walked into a situation in a republic that was frayed and made this a big deal. And as a result, our democracy is at risk. And we have so many citizens who are dumb and ignorant and hateful, who support Trump because they embrace discrimination. They don't believe in representation. They don't believe in equal justice before the law. So we're just going to have to put our shoulder to the problem and keep pushing. And I don't really see an easy way out of Colombia present. And I assume it's just going to be a mess. It's going to dissipate somewhat because of the end of the school season. But Colombia is talking about having a commencement, and that's an opportunity that can be abused. So I hope they figured out how they're going to do that. So this has not been a fun walk. I don't know if it's reassuring, but these things don't happen in a vacuum, and they're not happening in a vacuum. And we, as a society, having passed up the norms by which one could have avoided this in the first place, now have to deal with it after the fact. So I say hello to you from my 89-degree warm stroll among the cathedral of trees. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.